Hi everyone, welcome back to the second half of the semester. Hope you had a good break. Um, I have to apologise in advance for my delivery today. I'm a bit under the weather. Got a bit of flu, so I'm feeling better, but still in the recovery phase. So my delivery is a bit lackluster. I apologise in advance. Without further ado, let's get into it. This is lecture 7, second part of um, third part of our look at the intercultural communication. This week we'll be looking at contemporary issues in intercultural competence and communication as a broad theme. Some of the questions we'll be considering broadly are what do verbal communication styles vary across cultures? How do verbal communication styles vary across cultures and what influence do they have? What is the particular significance of high and low context communication and the various forms that cross-cultural communication can take? What influence can social forms of organisation like individualism and collectivism have on identity and culture, and how can these be expressed as forms of communication? So keep those in mind as broad trajectory of the lecture today. To recap from week 6, the last week before we went on break, you'll recall that we looked at combining an assessment and learning styles as an issue of metacognition, using the experiential learning techniques to look at how we can bring ourselves into the stages of DMIS and work through them. We'll look at those a bit more in the tutes this week, I think. Work on applying the methods to the DMIS. You'll recall we looked at non-verbal communication, facial expressions, non-verbal vocal cues, gestures, body postures, interpersonal distance, touching, and gaze. We looked at language, cultural identity as an aspect of cultural studies in intercultural communication. As identity is a construct of culture and vice versa, culture written into and transmitted through language. Look at that a bit more next week in week 8, with specific reference to gender as probably one of the greatest areas of intercultural conflict and miscommunication. You'll recall in week 5 we looked at experiential learning model, the learning cycle, and cultural studies and cultural taxonomies. We'll look at the taxonomies in a bit more detail today, as you'll see, and the experiential learning model and cycle we'll look at in the tutes as features of moving through the DMIS. So key concepts for this week are verbal communication as a feature of metacognition. We did non-verbal communication in week 6, so this week is the verbal complement to that one. As there's a particular feature of verbal communication, we'll look at high and low context communication. This sort of tends to define a lot of the ways that we can understand verbal communication. And to round this off today, we'll look at the social identity theory and communication accommodation theory as features of verbal communication. So that's what we'll be looking at today. So let's start with verbal communication. What is verbal communication? The communication styles, the way that people communicate with others verbally and non-verbally. Combines both language and non-verbal cues is the mental message that dictates how listeners receive and interpret verbal messages. There's a great link down the bottom to an article by Lou, which you can look up through the library journals access, which I'll give you a bit more detailed information. And as a particular feature of verbal communication, we have high and low context communication. This defines a lot of what we're going to be looking at today. So what do we mean by high and low context communication? Speech patterns are conditioned by social context. So, whether there's it depends on how much context there is. If there's If you're talking with someone in a highly defined context, then that actually that creates more possibilities in terms of subtlety and nuance, I think. Whereas in low context, where you're talking with strangers, there's little sort of outside information to inform what you're talking about. Everything's going to be very straightforward, to the point, direct. No nuance, no subtlety. So these are the kind of differences we're looking at, I think. As a great example, jargon or shorthand speeches as restricted codes used by used by doctors, engineers, prisoners, street gangs, or between family members and close friends. I mean, you have jargon or shorthand amongst where there's high context, a lot of shared understanding. The jargon and shorthand, becomes meaningless in low context, where there isn't the shared understanding. So this is the difference, I think. And these restricted codes involve transmission of messages through verbal, words, non-verbal, intonation, facial features, gestures, channels, as we saw in week 6. So in week 6, we looked at the non-verbal aspect of transmission of messages. This week we're looking at the verbal transmission of messages in the form of these codes, this jargon or shorthand, which requires high context, this high level of shared understanding. This high context, the high level of shared understanding relies heavily on the hidden implicit cues of the social context, such as interpersonal relationships, the physical and psychological environments, and other contextual cues. Succinct, simple assertions used against a backdrop of common assumptions, closely shared interests, identifications, and shared expectations. They presuppose a local cultural identity, which reduces the need for the speakers to elaborate their intent verbally and make it explicit. Meanings are known primarily to the members of such groups. In the context of national culture, the shared understandings of Australian culture writ large form a high context. If you come in from outside, I mean, think of all the slang that Australians use, rhyming slang. You talk about being on the rock and roll. No one's going to understand. I mean, if there's not the shared understanding, no one's going to understand what you're talking about in terms of the shared culture. Give me the dead horse. If you're eating a pie, have you got any dead horse? No one, I mean, someone from a different culture is going, what are you talking about? Whereas, someone, a local is more kind of likely to understand, okay, it's rhyming slang, and dead horse is tomato sauce. So that sort of presupposes, a reasonably high context level of communication. And again, if you're talking to someone who wouldn't get rhyming slang, you'll say, "Can I have the tomato sauce, please?" Because there's a low context. So here's a couple of examples of high and low context communication. We have Walter White on the top left, throwing up the gang signs, West Side. If you understand the gang sign, you'll get it. If you don't, it looks like a guy in a yellow jacket doing I don't know, could be the Vulcan symbol for all you know. And I think the character as well involves some level of shared understanding as well. I mean, if you're familiar with Breaking Bad, you'll go, "Oh, that's Walter White, the protagonist." If you don't watch HBO, it'll just it won't make any difference either. But combination of the gang sign and the central character of a TV series about a chemistry teacher who starts cooking meth when he contracts cancer, then you go, okay, well, there's a lot going on there. But again, it requires high context, high level of shared understanding. I'm a Breaking Bad fan, so it resonates. Beneath that, we've got a lot of jargon, economic jargon from from economics, aggregate, demand, opportunity making, interdependent, productivity, cost benefit versus specialization, monetary trade cycles, productivity, scarcity, employment. They're all very very area specific terms. If you're not a professional economist or like someone who spends a lot of time reading about economics, it might be a bit muddy. So again, there's a high context for communication. Sort of the assumption of shared understanding, and that you're gonna that these are all gonna make sense. If you're if you're in a if you don't have that shared understanding, then it's not. That it sounds more like a jargon, which I mean, to me it looks like jargon. And on the to the right of this, we have a perfect example of that. I think quantitative easing. I mean, if that isn't jargon, what is? I believe that quantitative easing is what they did after the 2008 GFC. Of course, when they bailed out the too big to fail banks who had caused the crisis by throwing, what was it, over $1 trillion at them, in order to, they didn't throw, give any money to debt relief for the people whose subprime mortgages had failed and were consequently homeless. But they did bail out the too big to fail banks to the tune of over $1 trillion. So I think they, in that case, they came up with the jargon in order to disguise what they were really doing, which was arguably socialism for the rich. Free market discipline for the poor, for everyone who had a subprime mortgage and was rendered homeless, but huge bailouts for the banks, and of course most of them gave it to, their a large part of it was paid out to the CEOs and the board as bonuses, which is quite scandalous, really, I think. But again, they use the quantitative easing to create a high context for communication in order to, arguably, in order to make what was going on incomprehensible to everyone else on purpose. So quantitative easing is always, I always think, is a classic. Above that is a meme. I actually made this meme in Photoshop, so I hope you like my Photoshop and memeing skills. This is. Of course, the Ancient Aliens meme with the guy from what was it, the History Channel or something like that, who explained everything as aliens, and the initial meme was this guy with this crazy hair talking about aliens, and has the hands up, sort of trying to explain this crazy idea. So yeah, I photoshopped out his head and put in Wilders instead, and instead of aliens, Muslims, because just explaining the crack smoking conspiracy theory he comes out with. I mean, it's the same difference arguably, but again, because of the the memeing culture, you need to be familiar with the meme to get it. So, and otherwise, because it's a high context form of communication, have to explain it otherwise. So that was my wacky sense of humor coming out there, and get wild as hopefully getting the pain on some level. That was the idea anyway. But again, high context communication, and without the context requires explaining. So that's the general idea there. Is another example I came up with to hopefully sort of put things into further perspective. On the left hand side, we've got an image which requires no explanation. A fairly what's the right word? Universal advertisement for Coca-Cola. Requires no explanation. You see it everywhere. enjoy Coca-Cola. In the middle is a artwork from what I guess is the Chinese Revolution. A bunch of Chinese soldiers hoisting the red flag on top of a flagpole somewhere. It looks like they're in a large building somewhere. They're on top of a large stone wall, hoisting the red flag. Medium level communication. I mean, you probably need to know a bit about Chinese history for that to make any sense. Okay, bunch of Chinese people hoisting a red flag probably has something to do with the Chinese Revolution. Okay, not quite as universal as the Coke symbol, but sort of. If you know a little bit about history, you can sort of take a rough guess. And on the right hand side is something a bit more specific. This is the back cover of a punk rock album from the late 70s. Give Me Convenience or Give Me Death by the Dead Kennedys. A classic album. I think a personal favorite. But you can see on the back, this is the artwork. This is the combination of the two prior images by an American artist called Winston Smith. Actually, there's a website you can look his stuff up. He does a lot of collage art. He's combined the recognizable universal symbol of the Coke ad with this Chinese artwork to create a artistic mashup. I think what adbusters would call a culture jam. So now you have the soldiers hoisting the flag, but instead of hoisting the red flag, they're hoisting the flag for Coca-Cola, which I think, as to my reading, is a statement on maybe on imperialism. On maybe it's a statement about the what happened to the Chinese Revolution. It sort of went a bit awry. Now China's the workshop for the Western world. They have sort of some of the most exploited workers in the on the planet. Foxconn, for example, which makes all the Apple parts, had to install suicide nets as one fairly infamous example. Because the working conditions were so tough, the workers there were just killing themselves by jumping off the factory, the roofs of the factory buildings, and so they installed suicide nets and had to get the new hires to sign no suicide pledges. And this is in the glorious communist utopia of China. So I think this is what Winston Smith is trying to allude to, but again, perhaps requires a bit more context and what we would call scaffolding. Like a bit of to get that shared understanding. Definitely recommend the album if you're interested in checking out something different. So, with high and low context communication as the backdrop, let's look at some of the ways that this can, these forms of communication can manifest. First one is covert and overt messages, with examples such as ambiguous language using words interpretable in more than one way. These can be used for sort of good or ill. You can take a subtle dig at someone, or flirting, for example. Phrasing. You didn't do what I asked you to do. We'll receive a different response. Then I'm afraid this hasn't been done quite the way I intended. So you can. The way we phrase concepts, way we phrase things can send messages as well that the kind of thing that's read in between the lines. You didn't do what I asked you to do will come off sounding more accusatory than, I'm afraid this hasn't been done the way I intended. So somewhat you phrase something in a non-accusatory kind of way, and the recipient will go, okay, well, what can I do to make things right? So there's a that that tone. The way we the tone we use. So I mean, tone of voice, that's just great. Can be used to convey sarcasm, irony, pleasure, and even displeasure, depending on how it's said. I mean, these are sort of different sides of the same coin. I think. I mean, phrasing can communicate a certain tone, but also the tone we use can communicate intentionally or unintentionally messages of their own, depending on the context. And communicating between cultures, we need to be mindful of the context that we're in, and the level of understanding. That I think, as a general rule, probably the lower context, the more direct and straightforward things need to be. Just talking to people in general. I mean, you can begin to play with meaning once there's sort of a certain level of shared understanding. And of course, non-verbal signals as covert and overt messages, which we looked at in week 6. Gaze, gesture, body language. I mean, all the subtle messages that we send, sometimes covertly, without even, without sort of, being saying what we're doing overtly. But we can also, of course, we can also send overt messages through non-verbally, by standing over people and things of that order. A few examples of covert and overt messages. On the left, the spoken conversation. Take out the trash, please. With the father and the teenager, you do it. And the subtextual conversation of the adult saying, "Can't you do something? Can't you do something useful for a change, you lazy kid?" And the kid saying, "Stop being down on me. I feel bad enough already." So everything that's sort of being said in between the lines. There's not just the spoken conversation. There's everything that's going on within the context of the relationship between the father and the kid. So I mean, these are the kinds of things that we sort of need to be mindful in terms of high and low context communication. On the right as well, we've got the people out on the date. Would you like to come in for some coffee? Inverted commas. And on the right, well, yes, I would love to have some coffee. Inverted commas. So they're going to have a good night, presumably, but obviously, the context is fairly clear. Both talking about coffee, and neither of them mean coffee, and it's obvious from the context. So some fairly is that covert or overt? I don't know. It's fairly borderline. It's about looks they're not saying what they mean, but the intention is inescapable. So it's kind of an interesting one there. But yeah. Again, that's a reflection of the context. Another aspect of high and low context communication: direct and indirect. A direct communication style, typically practiced in low context communication cultures, is one where messages reveal the speaker's true intentions, opinions, and needs. An indirect communication style is one where the verbal message is often designed to camouflage the speaker's true intentions, opinions, and needs. In other words, the speaker does not mean what he or she literally said. So in the direct, in the direct style, it's taking things on face value. In the indirect style, we're reading, we're looking at the context and reading between the lines. I think, as a general rule, we need to be probably need to be clear on which context we're in to figure out whether we do need to take things on face value, or whether we need to read between the lines and figure out if figure out if there's anything there. I think so. This is probably part of the challenge of intercultural communication and developing intercultural competence. So the indirect style reflects a cautious attitude towards the expression of negative and confrontational verbal messages. The indirect style is more concerned with overall emotional quality of interactions than with the meanings of specific words or sentences. Courtesy often takes precedence over truthfulness, emphasis on maintaining social harmony as a primary function of speech in interpersonal interactions. Agreeable and pleasant answers to questions when literal factual answers might be perceived as unpleasant or embarrassing. In the literature, they talk about this being a feature of Asian cultures. It doesn't appear to be a feature of Australian culture writ large, which is, I think, fairly brusque, which can be a good thing sometimes if people are straightforward, but problematic perhaps if it means we think without speaking. I think we find that people always say, "Well, I say what I think," but then as if that's sort of in and of itself a good thing. Well, it's good to be direct, but saying what you think is of limited value if you don't think about what you say first. So in an indirect style, this would be probably in an indirect communication style. This would be sort of probably the original sin of miscommunication, or the greatest failing. I mean, to think about and to think about what you're saying and be concerned with effects. I guess the maybe the approach here is to maintain open channels. So if there is if there are problems, you maintain the channel, and maybe can work towards resolving them amicably. Maybe the downside is suppressing disagreements in favor of in favor of keeping things nice. I mean, I guess the trick is to be able to negotiate these so that you communicate in an indirect style. You communicate effectively without without sort of stepping on anyone's toes in terms of the concern with overall emotional quality of interactions. On the other hand, we've got the direct communication style, which is a feature of individualistic cultures most prevalent in the West. In the direct communication style, good and competent communicators, as noted, are expected to say what they mean and mean what they say. Excuse me. Evasiveness is likely to be perceived as unreliable or dishonest. Social approval is given to those who are capable of expressing ideas and feelings in a precise, explicit, straightforward, and direct fashion. In a direct communication style, if misunderstanding occurs, the message sender tends to assume the primary responsibility for failing to construct and deliver an unambiguous message. Specific words that are said are used to decode meaning rather than relational aspects that are never explicitly stated. So I think it's there are, again, as noted, there are probably positives and negatives to this approach. I mean, to the extent that we do think about what we say before we say it, there's the direct, direct and unambiguous style, so it's clear what's being said. On the downside, I mean, there's relatively little context for communication, so maybe less opportunity for nuanced speech or subtlety. But again, it's the trick is probably to negotiate a middle ground between the two. There's one, I mean, here's one example of direct communication. It's you can make up your own mind about how you the issues that this one raises. I think it's funny. So the job interview scenario: what's your greatest weakness? Honesty. I don't think honesty is a weakness. I don't give a shit what you think. So this is the this is a direct style where people are saying what they think. Uh, the guy who says, "I don't think honesty is a weakness," is going to be eating his words. As may well the interviewee, who has admitted that honesty is her greatest weakness, and in favouring the interviewer by obliging his opinion that honesty isn't a weakness, has maybe done herself out of a job. So I think this is it's interesting in terms of kind of raising some of the issues that are potentially involved. In direct communication cultures, especially in the West, I mean, we do claim to value openness and directness and saying what we think. But then, what happens when someone says something you don't want to hear? I mean, maybe this is one of the maybe it's one of the shortcomings of the direct approach, and B, potentially a way of, the great way of generating not only misunderstanding but tension and conflict when dealing with other cultures. I mean, we're definitely creating conflict within a direct communication style here. So definitely something to keep in mind. Another aspect of high and low context communication is self-enhancement and self-effacement. I think linked quite specifically to direct and indirect communication. Communication styles based on maintaining a particular sort of feeling versus sort of saying what you think, kind of regardless of the effect. So this dimension involves the degree to which positive aspects of the self are intended, elaborated, and emphasized in interpersonal interactions. Self-enhancement communication style is used when an individual is open and direct about his or her abilities, contributions, or accomplishments. The self-effacement communication style is used when an individual uses verbal restraints, hesitations, modest talk, and self-deprecation when discussing his or her own abilities, contributions, or accomplishments, or when responding to others' praises. In collectivistic cultures, self-effacement through playing down one's individual performance and stressing the contribution of others helps maintain group harmony. In these high context communication cultures, the message receiver is expected to detect and appreciate the message sender's modesty, as well as the intention to enhance others' faith through self-effacement. Generally assume that praise should come from others, and the use of self-effacement is often expected to result in the message receiver's positive rather than negative evaluations. So in high, this is where we have a lot of kind of mutual understanding that the roles of people in communication. Understanding of sort of reciprocal relations, I think, and of rights and responsibilities. In this kind of with a view to maintaining group harmony, which doesn't tend to be as much of a focus of individualistic cultures, apparently. So we can see that with through self-effacement, you play down your own achievements in order to not to sort of antagonize others, and how we describe it, these sort of personal qualities are affirmed. We get that affirmation through from others instead, through sort of positive feedback. On the other hand, the other approach is to sort of big up or big note yourself, and look for approval or confirmation from others, I think. So we find in individualistic, low-context communication cultures, the use of encouragement promotes individual self-esteem and self-efficacy. Self-enhancement helps to promote individuality because it promotes an individual to directly assert thoughts, express desires, and promote his or her self-image. Due to an analytical thinking style, members of low-context communication cultures are likely to interpret self-effacement messages at their face value. Our research shows that European Americans perceive self-effacing behaviours as reflecting low competency rather than efforts at group cohesion. Possibly a reflection of the kind of general lack of critical thinking. I think the differences between the two are interesting to contemplate, not just in terms of communication styles and intercultural competence, but sociologically as well. Especially when we look at the types of personalities that the two approaches tend to produce. A couple of examples of I think sort of fairly prominent exhibitors of different styles. The POTUS, the President of the United States of America, has a very pronounced self-enhancement style, as does Kanye West. Possibly sometimes occasionally to their detriment. There's a little phenomenon called hubris, which if you do it too much, kind of tends to if you engage in too much self-enhancement, that tends to become a grandiosity, I think. And I think the general phrase is writing checks with your mouth that your ass can't cash. So that's potential problem with self-enhancement when it gets toxic and unhealthy. I think both of these characters have a tendency to write bad checks verbally through self-enhancement. But by the same token, in a healthy way, I mean, self-enhancement sort of promotes it can be potential for like an assertive, I mean, you can be assertive while respectful, but maybe the point is to be mindful of the difference between the two and make sure you don't turn into a Trump or Kanye West, especially when dealing with people from self-effacement backgrounds, because for all we know, everyone who adopts a self-enhancement style looks like one of these two wacky characters compared to people from their own culture. So if that's not enough to scare you straight, then I don't know what is. But hopefully that sort of puts things into perspective a little bit. On the other side, we've got self-effacement communication style. Jacinda Ardern, who did that to masterful effect recently, in responding to the atrocity in Christchurch. And Malala Yousafzai, the Nobel Prize winner, I don't think I pronounced that correctly, who has been sort of prominent in campaigning for education for women in the Middle East, I believe. I'm sure she's done more than that. I have to pardon my ignorance, but she does seem to have quite a pronounced self-effacement style. Very humble communicator. So again, the potential drawback of the self-effacement style is to become a doormat, I think, especially if you're dealing with a Trump or West type character. Which just reminds me, actually, I think Freud's basic concept of the id, based on the tension between the the ego and the superego. The ego is the demands of the self, and the superego is the demands of society. And the identity is what arises out of a resolution of the conflict between the two. When we're born and we're in the crib, we only know our own demands, and we cry at all time of day and night to be fed and loved and all the rest of it, because we do only know our own needs. And when we as we grow up, we sort of learn to recognize that other people exist and they have rights and needs, just as we do, and that they're of equal importance. So we temper our own demands in recognition of that fact, and hopefully somewhere along the way sort of mature into adults. I think as a general thing related to this question, that the trick is to, whether we sort of adopt a self-effacement or self-enhancement style, is to negotiate this tension between the ego and the superego, and to neither to become a doormat or to become a sociopath. I think there's at least one sociopath in this picture, so again, something to perhaps to provide a inspiration for doing the right thing. But in terms of intercultural communication, I think those are this is hopefully provides a framework for applying recognizing and applying communication styles appropriately, using recognizing self-effacement without sort of seeing it as people playing a doormat, or lacking competency, and applying or recognizing self-enhancement style without becoming like a egomaniac psychopath or sociopath, narcissistic personality disorder type. So it's a bit of negotiating and work to do there, but given the strength of character of those who appear to have applied the self-effacement style appropriately, potential for greatness, perhaps. Another aspect of high and low context communication, elaborate and understated. I think we can start to see how these, hopefully start to see how these all fit together. Elaborate style refers to the use of expressive language, sometimes with exaggeration or animation, in everyday conversations. An understated style involves extensive use of silence, pauses, and understatements in conversations. Interethnic miscommunication may arise when elaborate cultures perceive understated cultures as verbally detached and distant, and understated cultures may perceive elaborate cultures as emotionally threatening and intimidating. See anyone here as potentially emotionally threatening and intimidating, depending on their communication style? I don't know. I reckon you might be able to come up with one, two. In an exaggerated communication style, individuals often feel compelled to overassert in almost all types of communication because in their culture, simple assertions may be interpreted to mean the opposite. Again, that's probably an effect of looking at what we saw here about self-effacement being interpreted as reflecting low competency rather than efforts at group cohesion. So again, hopefully we're kind of seeing where these sort of link up. On the other hand, in an understated communication style, people who speak little tend to be trusted more than people who speak a great deal. Therefore, in such cultures, silence allows an individual to be socially discreet, gain social acceptance, and avoid social penalty. Perhaps we can say, in a high context situation where there's a lot of shared understanding. speaking less can mean more because there's greater import for what is actually said. But in a low context communication environment, we rely on exaggerated communication styles to make up for the lack of context. So, I mean, interesting contrasts there, really, between the two. I'm not necessarily how it is always. I mean, but here we go. Here we have a couple of potential examples of the elaborate and understated styles. Here we've got the guy doing the classic. I think this is supposed to be an Italian sort of mannerism. Versus the Asian ladies on the right, who have sort of, I think, with probably with higher context for more highly structured context for communication, which brings us again to the issue of individualism and collectivism, and how this bears on the creation of high and low context. As I said in the literature, I mean, they tend to describe European and Asian cultures in terms of individual versus collective. European being individual versus Asian being collective. Excuse me, with all the differences that appear in terms of overstated and understated, and the others. From this in this taxonomy, members of individualistic cultures are socialized into major societal values such as independence, freedom, and privacy. Members of individualistic cultures tend to acquire independent self-concepts, viewing themselves as unique and unconstrained individuals, free to express themselves, and are more likely to prefer a sender-orientated, low-context communication style. On the other hand, members of collectivistic cultures are socialized into major societal values such as interdependence, relational harmony, and connectedness. Members of collectivistic cultures tend to view themselves as part of social relationships, largely influenced by the thoughts, feelings, and actions of others in the relationship. And they are likely to prefer a receiver-orientated, high-context communication style. So here's a few potential examples of individualism versus collectivism with import for communication styles. On the left, we've got a bunch of African kids sitting around in a circle with a nice circle formed out of their feet. Text reads, an anthropologist proposed a game to the kids in an African tribe. Put a basket full of fruit near a tree and told them that whoever got there first won the sweet fruits. When he gave them the signal to run, they all took each other's hands and ran together and sat in a circle enjoying their treats. When he asked them why they chose to run as a group when they could have had more fruit individually, one child spoke up and said, Ubuntu. How can one of us be happy if the others are sad? Ubuntu in the Xhosa culture means I am because we are. So I think that's a fairly striking example of collectivism, fairly alien to the West. Another example from the Dalai Lama, who said, when asked what surprised him most about humanity, he answered, man, because he sacrificed his health in order to make money. Then he sacrifices money to recuperate his health. Then he is so anxious about the future that he does not enjoy the present. The result being that he does not live in the present or the future. He lives as if he was never going to die, and then dies never having really lived. That's fairly strident criticism of, I think, of Western individualism in particular, but with significant import for communication, arguably. Where our cultural priorities are, perhaps, expressed below by Michael Douglas's Gordon Gekko and Wall Street, 1987. Greed is good. There's not very much subtlety or nuance to that one, is there? not a lot of shared understanding. He's being fairly direct about his fairly direct and unambiguous. Greed is good. Um, Perhaps a potentially slightly better example of um, the direct approach to communication. Next up is Keith Flint, the recently deceased uh, frontman for the Prodigy. Fairly, got the tats and the punk hairdo, and the artistic creativity. Sort of interesting contrast to the Michael Douglas character, and the mentality that the Dalai Lama discusses. And beneath Keith, we've got the All Blacks, who are doing the haka at the start of a game. Sort of interesting kind of. Well, there's some in the culture. There's some communication going on there through the tribal dance. Interesting that's happening. That they're New Zealand is a individualistic Western society, but they're sort of combined with the collectivist culture of the Maoris. So interesting juxtaposition of cultures there. But again, we're just general things to try to illustrate some of the contrasts between the two, and the cultural and communicative dynamics that tend to arise. So that's the verbal communication aspect of the lecture for today. There's a few different approaches to looking at the high and low context communication. As a corollary to looking at verbal communication today, I want to look at social identity theory quickly. What is social identity theory? Social identity theory argues that people derive esteem from a group in which they positively identify, providing motivation to favor the in-group. People allocate more resources to the in-group to maximize the differences between it and the out-group. We find that this is the psychological basis for ethnocentrism as a particular kind of in-group favoritism, but it's not either the only one. As I think we've discussed, we've got even within our own society, forget national differences. We've got differences between gender, in addition to race, ethnicity, gender, class, ability, sexuality. Every kind of education level, every way that people differ can be used, I think, as the basis for in-group and out-group dynamics. So, and social identity theory clearly talking about some of the dynamics involved in those as well. Social identity theory argues that a person's self-concept comprises a personal identity and a social identity, and that the social identity is based in comparisons people make between in-groups, groups they belong to, and out-groups, groups they do not belong to. People strive to maintain a positive social identity by either joining groups where they feel more comfortable, or by making a more positive experience of belonging to the groups they already belong to. We could probably relate this to what I was talking about earlier in terms of the Freudian tension between the ego and the superego. I mean, if we've got the personal identity and the social identity can be compared to the ego and the superego, then maybe the part of what forms the pull of the superego is the dynamics of the in-groups. Probably theorize at length about this, but it's considering that, I mean, to the extent that in groups kind of tend to have a group think, kind of sort of not entirely healthy kind of group think kind of mob mentality about them. Maybe this is sort of one of the ways that the group, or dare I say it, the herd sort of tends to sort of pull the identity towards the collective, not in a positive, healthy way, but in a kind of in a way that's destructive of personal identity, and destructive and sort of harmful to people not in the in group, especially in we get to when we think about things like ethnocentrism. I mean, it's clearly potentially harmful. I mean, especially if the group think of the racialized in group leads to hate crimes. So these are arguably some of the broader issues that are involved. There's a link down the bottom, the story of social identity. Check that out if you're keen to look at this one a little more. Social identity theory says that in-group favoritism leads to the maximization of similarities within groups and the differences between groups. This process, it argues, consists of 3 stages. 1, social categorization. People first categorize themselves and others into social groups based on external or internal criteria. 2, social identification. People identify with a group, invest emotionally, and change their behavior to some extent because of their membership. 3, social comparison. People compare their groups to others in order to acquire esteem for their identified membership. I think it's probably worth keeping these in mind, how they relate to the first 3 stages of the developmental model of intercultural sensitivity. I mean, what's going on in terms of social categorization, social identification, and social comparison in denial, defense, and minimization. I think if we think about it, we can see a bit of these in each one of those. I mean, the in-group favoritism leading to the maximization of similarities within groups and differences between groups seems to me to, that's got denial and defense and minimization written all over it. The maximization of similarities within groups sounds a bit like a minimization to me in particular. A maximization of similarities being used as a framework for an assimilative equality where everyone's allowed to be part of the the in group as long as they assimilate abandon their culture and individuality and take on the dominant culture. So that's it for the lecture this week. Here's your readings for week 7. Second year students, you got the Educator's Guide to the Early Learning Framework for Australia. We looked at this at the start of semester. There's a bit from Henry Giraud, Cultural Studies, Public Pedagogy, and the Responsibility of Intellectuals, and something from Clive Harbour on International Developments and the Rise of Education for Democracy. Third years have got an additional reading, Intercultural Responsibility, Power and Ethics in Intercultural Dialogue and Interaction. We'll probably look at the pedagogy stuff in detail next week. I did have some lined up to look at it in the lecture this week, but the intercultural, the verbal communication stuff was more important. I think the pedagogy stuff will be more relevant in terms of looking at the issues related to the cultural studies, things we're going to look at in terms of identity, culture, and and communication. And we'll use the pedagogy stuff to look at how we can sort of respond to these the issues that are raised proactively. But there are your readings in the meantime. Tasks for this week are your assessment task 4.3, which is the responses to the developmental model of intercultural sensitivity on up on Moodle. This week is stage 3 minimization. You should have the alert from Moodle from the thread that went up this morning. I think the main thing to keep in mind for this one is that it's the last stage of the ethnocentric stage. You'll need to explain your response. You'll need to explain how it differs from stage 2 defense and stage 4 acceptance. You need to point out how your example differs from the ethno-relativism that comes up in week 4. I hope you, if you have any issues with this one, drop me a line. If you want to send me a draft, I'm happy to look at drafts. It's Bennett said this is sort of the most complex form of ethnocentrism, so it's kind of to be expected. It'll be a potentially harder than the other ones to deal with, but give it your best. Your responses so far, by and large, have been pretty great. So I think I would be surprised if you all didn't pull off something decent. And yeah, as I say, just hit me up if you have any issues. Coming up next week is your assessment task 3.3. This is the 3rd Moodle quiz. We'll have another 2 after that. You'll get a Moodle alert for that at the start of the week, so you'll have until Sunday night to complete. So yeah, keep an eye out for that one. Thanks for sticking around, and have a great week, and I'll see you on Moodle, no doubt. All right.